Thank you very much for joining us today. Today we'll be discussing the topic is dispute resolution in the times of COVID, the interplay between the General Counsel and the Council. As you may have seen, we have a stellar panel today comprising of 4 General Counsel, and then we have Mozam who will participate in this discussion as a counsel. Now, Vyapak and I will moderate the session. So to that extent, our job is relatively very simple. Brief round of introduction. Jyoti Pawar, she is the Senior Vice President and Deputy General Counsel Global at Infosys. She brings together nearly 30 years of practice and has worked at multiple law firms and corporates such as Economic Law Practices, Bharti Airtel, so on and so forth. Our next speaker is Deepti Gandhi. She's the Senior General Manager and Head Litigation at Mahindra & Mahindra. In a career of nearly 30 years, she has worked in multiple roles. She has previously worked with law firms like AZBN Partners and corporates such as ICICI Bank, Royal Bank of Scotland. Then our next speaker is Ashish Chandra. He leads the legal and regulatory affairs of WhatsApp for India. In the past, Ashish has worked with large Indian companies and US companies like Netflix, eBay, Reliance Jio, Snapdeal. Over the last 20 years, Ashish has first-hand witnessed and contributed to the growth of internet business and related regulations and jurisprudence in India. Then the next speaker is Damandeep Kaur. Damandeep is the Senior Vice President and the Head of Legal at Teleperformance India. She was a practicing lawyer before the Delhi High Court before switching roles and has previously worked with Intelenet Global Services and Evalueserve. And finally, Mozam Khan. Mozam heads the global litigation and is a leader in the international dispute resolution and investigations practice at Nishit Desai Associates. Briefly about Vyapak and me, Vyapak heads the international dispute resolution and investigations practice at NDA, and I'm a leader in the same practice. Before I move on, I must thank Association of Corporate Counsel for very generously agreeing to be joint host for this webinar, and special thanks to Brendan who sort of helped us in preparing for this webinar. Now, before I will quickly set the context, and then I'll hand it over to Vyapak, who will be the moderator for the session. Now, the present pandemic has made it very difficult to not only manage the existing disputes, but also to identify and avoid disputes. And the things have become worse because of the liquidity crunch which all the corporates are facing. Although the courts have started functioning, but with very limited capacity, virtual hearings are happening. In the course of today's discussion, we will cover these aspects and see what the future lies in front of us. We will specifically cover the following sub-themes, like how to identify a dispute-prone area and how to avoid disputes. Increasingly, with the present situation, corporates are looking at dispute avoidance techniques, and that will be a part of our discussion. How to manage pre-dispute stage, how to mediate a dispute. There are various options of dispute resolution in the present scenario. It could be mediation, could be arbitration, could be litigation, could be conciliation. We'll discuss primarily litigation and arbitration and what are the nuances, what are the practices, and what are the latest trends. Then we'll come on to settlement of disputes, managing the cost of disputes, and finally, we'll also briefly touch upon third-party funding. This is a new concept getting increasingly popular in India. I will briefly touch on that. Now, with that background, I now pass on I now request Vyapak to take over and initiate the proceeding. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks a lot, Alipak, for the introduction, and thank you again, Jyoti, Ashish, Dipti, and Damandeep to join. And thanks a lot, Association of Corporate Counsel (ACC) and Brandon to give us an opportunity to run a webinar on this topic. The kind of participation we have seen, we have more than 300 registrations for this topic, shows the importance of this topic and the timely discussion. So thanks a lot, everyone, who have joined this discussion and debate. As a matter of housekeeping points, while we have four stalwarts and Mosam talking about their experience and particularly how those things would evolve post-COVID area, that's going to be our focus. We also would love if participants, engage with the speakers uh, even during the session. So if you have any questions, please feel free to write down those questions in the Q&A window, and we will take it through the session so that we can have a more engaging discussions. If you have any specific question for a specific speaker, please do write in the question so that you can get more relevant answer which you may be seeking. So coming to the topic and why this topic becomes that much more important. While in every business or a commercial transaction, disputes as a topic is always, considered that, okay, that's not what we are meant for. We are doing a joint venture, we are doing a business, we are on a growth path, we are investing, and therefore disputes is always something which you want to avoid. But in a way, it is something that you can't also ignore. And therefore, the better you take care of those situations, do some preemptive measures, you are, better prepared, or at least better prepared to avoid some of those disputes coming up. And if they come up, then you are better able to manage them. Now, in that context, the world post-COVID has changed quite a bit. As you know, for last 4 5 months, almost from March 23rd or 24th, the courts are only functioning for exceptionally urgent matters. There is no physical hearing which has happened since last 4 5 months, and with 30 million cases already pending, and with 4 5 months of courts not functioning, you can only imagine what is going to happen if you only rely on dispute resolution and not discuss dispute management or dispute mediation or dispute avoidance to start with. So things are going to be very different. To even remedies like your insolvency and applications to IBC are suspended for 6 months, particularly for the defaults which occur post lockdown. And therefore, some of those remedies are not even available, even if physical courts reopen. And I was just talking to someone recently that, lockdown has taught us what is essential and what is not essential. And we never knew that judicial system is a non-essential part of our life, because everything is getting opened, including people are talking about theaters and restaurants, but judicial system is still not open for service. So I think with that background, let me straight away jump onto the very important topic that we want to discuss and get sense from each one of you. And maybe Jyoti, if you want to start, and then we can go to Dipti and Ashish and Damandev. In terms of, your experience, uh, particularly from the last few years, uh, I'm sure there are thousands of contracts Infosys would be entering into. There are, hundreds of issues which come up, regulatory, employee driven, and others. How do you see this in terms of dispute prone areas in your business? And are there any specific action points that you think you would be implementing now? What would other companies, should be looking at? What's your take on dispute prone areas and possibly avoiding them in this situation?
Thanks, Vyapak. Thanks to the entire NDA team for inviting me. and also to all the participants who've taken time to dial into this call. So thanks a lot. So Vyapak, to answer your question on what are the dispute-prone areas, or the important thing I think is to identify what those dispute-prone areas are. And there are many, right? But I can talk about I think the top two that come to the mind all the time. The first one being it really starts at the business level, right? So what are the various processes that your business runs, which are high risk? So it's very, very important to highlight or work with the business. So the first step really where legal gets involved is to identify what those risks are. And different tools are used by different businesses. But once you've identified those tools, then you know that these are the ones that need to be monitored. Right? And I can give you two examples. One, we can talk about the telecom sector where there are license obligations. Now, that's very, very high risk, which involves network compliances or it involves operations compliances, various compliances specified by the DOT and the TRAI. So that's your high risk area, and it's very important to monitor those well. In the IT industry, it's of course delivery management, or it could just be service level management, right? There could be delays that you need to track. There could be various things that result in risk for a particular customer account. So it's important to first identify. So I would put that as a first step to avoid a dispute. The second step is operational. It's monitoring. It's work as usual. You continue working. And there is a review or a close monitoring process of each one of these accounts, right? And I mean, the operation or the customer commercial team should know when they're heading towards what we call the pre-red flag stage, right? Not really the red flag stage, but the pre-red flag stage. And that's when you then, highlight this to the legal team, and the commercial team then connects with the legal team and says, look, we're heading towards a dispute over here, or we're heading to a problem. Very important again for the commercial and legal teams to have trust, credibility, and an excellent relationship. I think these things are very important. When that comes to the legal team, I think the legal team then makes sure that every email, every communication, every document that is exchanged keeping in mind that this could become an issue, or this is making a customer want something, and how can we work towards resolving that for the customer. I think that's the approach that we would take. So vetting of everything and working very closely, even involving ourselves in the reviews, becomes extremely important. The second way that a legal team could probably assess, pre-dispute situation could be looking at all the litigations that we've had in the past and do a sort of a trend analysis of what has caused litigation. So there could be some 40 reasons why litigations happen, but what is maximum out of that, right? So you make a sort of a chart and you say, okay, 50%, 40% is towards, say, delays, or it's towards performance, or towards whatever, IP issues. It could be anything, right? It becomes extremely important to have this data with you and then highlight this to the relevant department or to the operations team or the delivery team. Even more important is to create a training module around it, right? And then create the importance, or the impact training. Like, if this has happened, this is the impact that it had on the company. This is the kind of settlement revenue that we had to lose out, or this is the kind of reputational damage. Or there could be various different impacts that you have, but it's important to share that with the team so that they understand why they need to do something. I think those two are really, really important. From a COVID perspective, you mentioned, I think what has changed, none of this changes, right? Business continues as usual, these issues continue, and all these processes we have put in place just continue as they are. But what has added over and above that is, for a company like ours, and for many companies, I think we are now looking at we have moved rather from a secure office environment to an open work from home environment, right? So data privacy and security becomes extremely important today. And all these different things about identifying, preempting risks, looking at trends around the world to see what is happening, where is the world headed, and how can we then create robust systems within, from an ISG perspective or an IT perspective, to make sure that we have new controls, we have new BCP guidelines, or we opt to follow customer guidelines. So constant monitoring is extremely important, and you have to have a very robust plan to mitigate this risk right at the start. It was, I think, in the first 10 days, 15 days to get the laptops to people, all of that, and then have firewalls in place. I think all that took a little time, but we are there. The other thing from a COVID perspective is employment-related matters, extremely important again for the HR team to work very closely with the employment lawyers and have again preempt what could be the issues, have a very fair and fair solution for all the employees, and sort of work closely right till the closure. There are class action suits being filed all over the world and various issues around, say, insurance, employment. Importance again to sort of keep a good work with counsels like your firm and many others to sort of get a good idea of what is happening in the world out there and how can we then put necessary process fillers to make sure this doesn't happen with us. So, I mean, important by and large, what I'm trying to tell you is that trends within the company and trends outside the company become equally important. So that's
Sure.
as far as the dispute goes. Yeah.
Sure. No, I think very, very detailed points that you raised. One of the interesting point you talked about was the employee related issues, and I think some of them may have been ignored earlier, which may actually become, big post-COVID, particularly when the employee is not in front of you all the time. Manipulations, frauds, non-compliances of policies, resulting into even a third-party non-compliance or a claim, right? So one is your internal issues with the employee, but that employee not following certain protocols can actually lead to, regulatory litigation or non-compliance or even customer suing, as you rightly said, for data breach or confidentiality. So I think that area I feel may require much more importance than what it was earlier, because those can actually turn into huge liabilities as we go forward. So I'll come back to you on that point in a while, but let me hear from the other speakers as well on their experience and expectations on this issue. And maybe Dipti, if you want to go first, or Damandeep,
Yeah,
one of
sure.
you.
Sure. So I think Jyoti's, so first, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, NDA and ACC for, allowing us to panel this discussion. It's been a real pleasure to be with you all. And thank you to the participants who have come in large numbers to hear us. Essentially, yes, I think Jyoti's covered a large spectrum of how disputes can be, reduced or avoided. What I can speak of is in relation to Mahindra and Mahindra as a conglomerate. And as a conglomerate, one knows that we sell numerous products and services, and therefore we are a consumer-based industry where a large portion of our disputes are consumer-based, and they are against cases and not so much by cases. As a general policy, Mahindra's avoids, filing by cases, and we try and see that there are internal settlements that take place. But so far as the against cases are concerned, people buy our products from, farm equipments to seeds to pulses to tractors to defense, and we have a wide spectrum of consumer products that we sell, automobiles being the largest. And therefore, to address how one can reduce consumer-based litigation, the litigation team has come up with a few things that we have found useful. Number one, it has prepared SOPs for business, and it actively interacts with business all across India and abroad on a very, very micro level. The second thing is we address notices that come from the consumers uh, in a very effective manner, as if we are responding to a consumer complaint. And therefore, what happens is we send out an interim reply on the same day that we receive the notice, and within 30 days, we send out a detailed reply. I think our conversion ratio from notices to consumer cases has dropped down from a massive 50-60% to near less than 20%. So, in that sense, we have managed to curb those disputes which are grievances which come to us in the form of notices. This is so far as the consumer or the against litigation is concerned. There are a few other against litigation, but not too many. The second thing that we do is we believe that um, we try and settle disputes if possible through our businesses, where we believe that either it's not a cost to our reputation or a cost to our pockets, and where we believe that there has been actually some error either on the dealer's part or our part or whatever. So to drag on that dispute just for the sake of dragging it on, or because there is a dispute, we avoid that completely, and therefore we try and settle them immediately as soon as the dispute arises. So these are a few things from a compliance perspective. If there are disputes under the Shops and Establishment Act or legal metrology, etc., we have a very, very strong compliance team. And that team takes care of very strong compliance policies and adhere through immense strong outreach to plants, etc., etc. And therefore, we have managed to reduce those disputes as well. So essentially, there are all these practical steps that we take to reduce disputes. And that's basically how Mahindra functions. Despite that, we do have a large number of cases because we are a consumer-based
Sure.
industry, essentially.
Sure. So I think the need for working more closely with the business and commercial teams, I think that is possibly the first takeaway from your perspective. And to, try and settle as many as you can, rather than drag. But more importantly, I think with the amendments to the Consumer Protection Act and the Product Liability Bill, which is now coming up. I'm sure your team is gearing up for possibly more litigation than earlier.
Sure, sure. So,
But hopefully, I think we'll all learn the ropes, as we say. But
yes.
that is going to be a big area as we go along. So I think with that, maybe Damandip, if you want to give your thoughts on how do you deal with the situations going forward, and maybe any additional points that you have.
Or so, like you rightly said, that the key takeaway thus far has been constant interaction with the business commercial teams. So that's very, very important. But I want to just take a step back to say that the identification or even avoidance of dispute rightly begins at the start of the relationship or an engagement. So when you're actually drawing the terms, is when you tend to realize that there could be some areas where you didn't have meeting of minds, could essentially later on become dispute prone areas, where you then have to constantly keep an eye and monitor to say, in that particular engagement or the service that I provided, is there, I have to keep an eye on that issue. So it essentially, for a legal counsel, it begins when you start talking about negotiating the terms of the engagement. You have to actually think to say that if I'm going to agree to something like this, is there a possibility of a dispute? What if there's a possibility of a dispute? And you have to think at that level and to that end when you're actually looking at the terms and the conditions of the engagement. So journey actually begins there. And the journey actually begins there because also, it's the essential job in-house counsel, to be honest, is that we need to avoid disputes. Our key KRA is that the least number of disputes is the best possible outcome for you.
That's true.
Yes. So keeping that in mind, what we do, in addition to all that Dipti and Jyoti have said, and those are very, very important points, and we do follow them. One other thing is we constantly keep in touch with the finance department as well. One of the key areas which, at least in the service industry, may not apply to all industries is on the payment side, where you have disputes where payments are either held back or you owe payments because of various issues. Is there invoice issue? Is there non-performance issues? So you have to keep in constant touch with the finance department, keep working with them constantly, say that payment should not become really a sore point for any sort of service to get stuck or a dispute to start or rise, or payment should not get stuck because of that. So identifying the dispute areas and avoiding dispute essentially begins with at the beginning, and also working constantly, and not just right at the start of the relationship or the end of the relationship, constantly working with the finance teams, the business teams, and all the other relevant stakeholders to keep on checking the health of how the particular engagement is performing. And lastly, what I would like to add also is that, and that from a personal experience as well, over the years that we have seen how we've been able to avoid certain disputes, is how you communicate. Because legal team if is involved right at the beginning of the communication, when the dispute may just be at the infancy stage. How do you write? How do you communicate? What sort of communication the business team is writing? What sort of verbiage they're using? And are they conveying the right message, or is there a meeting of minds there? Sometimes it's just an interpretation issue, one misunderstanding where the business is saying something else, or the client or the provider is saying something else. So that's where I think the legal team has to constantly be involved, ensure the right communication is there, constantly keep in touch with the various departments to monitor and have an end-to-end involvement to avoid disputes.
Sure.
In my
So I think you are right. Of course, we'll discuss the last topic that you spoke about as to how do you deal with the communication when you see that dispute is just brewing and not wait till it completely goes out of hand. But more importantly, you also touched upon a point that you actually start thinking about it when you are negotiating the contract rather than at the time when you are interpreting the contract. And maybe that is the right time to bring in Ashish, because he is definitely involved in a lot of advisory around that at his organization. But also in the past, he has advised senior management and board in terms of dealing with documentation. And it's always difficult because at that time everyone wants to converge and get a champagne and that yes, we are now in business, we have done a joint venture, nobody wants to talk about disputes. And at that stage, to think about it and create a nuisance is always a problem. So Ashish, how do you deal with those situations, or how have you dealt with those situations in the past, or what is your advice? And then maybe you want to touch upon the second point which Damandeep talked about, as if things have just begun, right? You are seeing the dispute is brewing. uh, any uh, any any kind of views or tips, do's and don'ts for pre-dispute stage that you may have, if you want to address both the questions together?
Yeah, so thanks, Vyapak. I think I would start that. I think the best time to draft the dispute clauses is that, after you take wine, or, after you had your champagne. You're the most creative, at that point of time. But, I would actually, on this lighter note, I would actually say that, I mean, it depends, like what Jyoti said and started that she started with a particular industry, which is telecom industry, right? So I think it depends upon industry to industry. How do you have to plan around the disputes? And let's say if I were to talk specifically about internet industry, when you are dealing with a particular product which has millions of users, right? Which use your services. So you have to, one type of contract which you are signing is more like a website T's and C's, which are like totally non-negotiable, and it has to be agreed by millions of or billions of users, either in India, across the world, and all. So how do you ensure that? And there would be some disputes because at some point of time, some person would not be happy with your services, or he or she may have face some problem. How do you ensure that your terms and conditions are like ready for a dispute management process, like what you said, or Damandeep said, and Jyoti said, class action suits. In US, you know that it should not go for a jury trial. Do you have the ability to ask the consumer to really, go for arbitration? Or if you are in a regulated industry, then there is an estoppel that you can't really go for a private time dispute. If you are in a fintech industry, then you have to follow some set patterns of RBI ombudsman or some sort of patterns of NPCI, stuff like that. So you have to keep in mind whenever you are doing something when it's a B2C contract, and C is not somebody who is like playing in, let's say, thousands of the customers or lakhs of customers. When you're playing with, let's say, millions and millions or going up to billions of, customers. The other side of the dispute is like the B2B dispute, which is like the B2B could be you are earning from that B2B transaction, or you are spending from that B2B transaction. So the way you have to look at that dispute is that your legal counsel, I think more than a lawyer, the in-house counsel, because we would always have the benefit to work with external counsels like yourself, right? So I think the key role of the in-house counsel, the key skill set which the management look up to, is that how depth is his or her understanding about the business. Is the legal counsel, the in-house legal counsel, at whatever level you have, right? Whether it is the general counsel or number two or a head of legal or somebody junior, how well they understand the business nuances, and how well, how can they think about potential dispute. I always considered, okay, myself as a project manager. When I used to work with Reliance Jio, and at that point of time, when they just bought the spectrum, and we were basically doing multi-billion dollars, multi-jurisdictional kind of contracts to build the entire 4G ecosystem in India. Then I used to assume the role of a project manager, that my role is not to just enter into just to see the clauses and all. No, I am the project manager. And I used to then get, we have built like a deal sheet which would have just one pager tick mark terms for our commercial team and the pricing team, that you just go and focus on the best price discovery, the best kind of your payment terms, and the best kind of delivery terms. Leave rest of the things to the technical team and the tax team, other team, but the entire thing has to be project managed by the legal team, right? So you need to have that project management experience or skill set. You need to have interpersonal skill set to really, get along well with your, various colleagues, because you are the one who have to put pen on the paper, right? Unless you have the ability to project manage amongst your cross-functional team, you are just like, drafting some English on a particular piece of paper without having that context to it. The other thing which I would say that disputes are of two types. One is a healthy dispute. I think any deal or any business which don't have a healthy dispute is a wrong signal that your business is not progressing, because this is a very dynamic world. The business practices, the business intent, and the regulation, the business opportunities changes very, very fast. The world which it was in the month of February, it's not the same which is right now in the month of August. And all the business principles which you may have agreed in the month of February may not remain the same now. So there will be healthy disputes, right? So these are the disputes which are healthy debates for people to realign their business strategy and make a new business model with the partners and move on in life. But your contract should anticipate that, yes, I would have healthy disputes. How do I facilitate the healthy disputes in a contract? But you also have to anticipate there would be unhealthy disputes, right? And how does your contract would then put all the placeholder clauses to ensure that the unhealthy dispute, as and when it happens, gives you a fair chance to put forward your point of view, and you are not being deprived of a of a fair justice just because you were relaxed when you were drafting those clauses. So I don't know whether I answered, but I just thought to share my mind while
Sure.
working with both internet company and also with a large telecom company.
So, Vyapak, can I add to what Ashish said?
Yeah, please,
So just
Jyoti, go ahead.
one more point on this. See, the other thing is very important is to understand what are the merits of your case. Right? So if you ask a business guy, every business guy will say, I have a great case. It's very important then to understand how great or what are the negatives and positives of a particular case, because then you know what you're going to be discussing, right? So you can't be overconfident about a point which is really not in your favor. So there again, the role of understanding what Ashish said, business as well as legal, comes,
Sure.
becomes very
No,
important.
that has become very, very critical. In fact, we experience this lately a lot for two or three reasons. One, the way the process of dispute resolution is going, whether it is arbitration, there is a statutory time period of 18 months, commercial courts are in place, things are moving pretty quick. and also they are very, very costly, right? Not only in terms of payment of fees to lawyers, it disrupts the business. So I think we nowadays give more advisory on whether to litigate or not to
Yeah.
litigate, rather than earlier the times was anyways file a case, anyways file a defense, doesn't matter, it will at least give you 5 years. And then, it is less costly than just paying it now, or, it did not disrupt the other points. But now, the ratings of the companies go bad with the litigations. The regulators look at very closely. The statutory auditors question them. The new business partners look at the behavior of the company. So there are a lot of other aspects which one has to take into account rather than just litigating. So strategy memos on whether to litigate or not litigate, and we'll discuss that a little later. But we have one more question for Mozam. Maybe Alipak, you want to take it from here, and then we come back to Jyoti and
Sure,
Ashish on the other points.
sure. So I think we have sort of covered, I mean, what are the steps which one needs to take, I mean, at the pre-dispute stage. I think it will be very important to also have Mozam's perspective, at least from when a brief comes to you, Mozam. What do you look at? I mean, is there a particular way, if the documentations are made, if that helps in litigating an arbitrating a case? How do you put without prejudice correspondence? I mean, how do you sort of document the initial notices and the letters which you will be exchanging with the counterparty? If you can share your thoughts.
Sure. So
By
I
the
think let
way,
me.
Mozam joins us from Jammu, and I don't know whether Jammu or Srinagar, but
Srinagar.
definitely
I'm
from
actually at a
much more exotic location. So
I'm actually at a
thanks for
campsite
joining.
near the Strawberry Valley. So I'm
Very
actually
nice.
very surprised that we have good internet connection here, which has enabled me to come on this call.
Excellent.
And it's a
So it's
beautiful
not
afternoon,
not,
and
not a good
I'm
idea to discuss disputes, but your views would be very, very helpful.
no, I'm actually I'm just trying to make you guys jealous that I'm sitting outside in a beautiful afternoon under a maple tree, and
Have the real
all you
background.
guys. All
Good,
right,
good.
I think without wasting any more time and making more people jealous, let me just try and answer Ali Park's question. So I think Ali Park, your question is essentially centered around managing that very critical stage, which is after you know that an issue has arisen between parties, but before you've actually gone into a full-blown dispute, whether it is litigation, arbitration, or whatever. So that management of the pre dispute stage, often one of the most critical stages, not just to avoid the dispute, but also to prepare for it and emerge victorious, or at least try and emerge victorious later on. So to answer this, I'll try and divide my answer in a couple of parts. The first part of managing the pre dispute stage is complying with your contractual provisions. So when the contracts, after years of being kept under lock and key, are finally taken out, which is the time when you're actually starting to look at the contracts when when an issue has arisen, and you actually see these terms that, okay, there's a term before I actually shoot off an arbitration notice, I may need to send a notice of breach or a notice of default. I may need to give a cure period. What should be that particular cure period? Is there a requirement for the principals of the two companies to actually engage in some sort of a settlement discussions before you go for a full blown dispute? All of these provisions are somewhere sometimes written down in contracts. So during the pre dispute stage, one thing which becomes often important is complying with these contractual provisions. The second subset of managing your pre-dispute stage often is the settlement talks and the settlement correspondence. Now, the goal of every vigilant and irresponsible organization would be to avoid the dispute to the extent possible. And so you're kind of continuing even during the pre-dispute stage, you're still trying to continue, or rather carry forward the dispute avoidance stage. So your settlement talks are still on, and in those talks, it's often advisable to make sure that you have what you were mentioning, the without prejudice correspondence. The idea of without prejudice correspondence often is that you don't uh, uh, you know uh, while engaging in a settlement discussion, you don't give up something which you may later on want to claim. And something that you've written in your in an email, or have had a discussion during the settlement phase, should not be taken against you at your dispute stage. So that's your settlement talks part of it. And just as a practical asterisk point, a lot of times when two principals talk and we talk settlement, and we try and eliminate middlemen such as myself, you actually end up having a lot more a lot more better chance of actually having a settlement. And this is just a side point. The third sub point of the pre-dispute stage is actually preparation for the dispute. Now, the preparation in itself can be obviously a cumbersome and an expensive exercise, but it's an exercise that you must undertake nonetheless, especially if you're of the view that the settlement talks are not going anywhere. So when I say preparation for the disputes, what do I mean? I mean, making sure that your draft pleadings are in order, making sure that your draft evidence statements are in order, especially when you're talking about arbitration, making sure that your counsel and your team, your legal team handling the disputes is fully prepared, your legal propositions are in place. You've anticipated what kind of a defense or a counterclaim you will be seeing in the dispute, and you have at least jotted down your points on rebuttal of the same. If there are issues of damages involved, or if there are issues of liability involved, then whether you want to engage an expert witness, a third party expert witness, you must have that discussion beforehand. The idea why I say all of this is a claimant has an inherent advantage when it comes to especially arbitrations, right? A claimant knows often months in advance what it has to do. So it will start preparing its statement of claim. It can start preparing its affidavits of evidence. It can start engaging with experts and have all that done. And then suddenly shoot out the arbitration notice and put everything on the respondent to do everything in that time bound manner. So let's say, as a claimant, before shooting out the notice of arbitration, I've had 3 months to prepare, and I've prepared everything. Then I file my statement of claim, and the arbitrator gives the respondent 1 month's notice to rebut that. I've had 3 months already. That's the inherent advantage that I'm talking about. Same thing with witness statements. If I've already prepared in advance and I've had my 5 witnesses and witness statements ready, I shoot them out. Again, the arbitrator gives the other side 1 month to rebut that. And I've had months of preparation. So you're essentially utilizing the pre-dispute stage to put the other party at a disadvantage. Now, a lot of times it works in the claimant's favor, but this is also something which the respondent must anticipate. So, while the inherent advantage is with the claimant, the respondent needs to make sure that it's working at maximum thrust to sort of lower that inherent advantage which the claimant has, especially in arbitration cases where timelines are really tight. Sorry, so these are broadly the three things
Sure.
that come to my
Sure.
mind when you're talking about pre-dispute
Sure,
stage.
Mausam. Thanks a lot for this. And, you know, uh, looking at where we are in terms of our discussions, yes, we all want to, avoid disputes, particularly post-COVID, where we want to focus more on business. Yes, we want to manage the pre-dispute stage much better to ensure that either we are very well prepared, or at least we find a solution, you know, to not go into dispute at all. But still, I don't think you can avoid some of the situations. As Ashish was saying, there are some healthy disputes as well. And these days, businesses work on, on the edge, right? Unless you take some of those risks, either regulatory or contractual, sometimes you don't win businesses. So you take those calculated risks. You interpret things in a particular way where there are no guidance or there is no clarity, and then you might have to deal with those situations as it comes. So disputes are, while you may want to avoid them, but in a way they are necessary for businesses to grow as well. Now, in that context, the second theme that we wanted to get our speakers to discuss, and maybe we can combine the 2 points, which is we first wanted to talk about mediation and then talk about litigation and arbitration. But if we may want to combine these two themes, because originally, at least from an Indian perspective, mediation was not even an option. I think there are several international and Indian developments. Maybe Alipak will give a little background, but that option is now on the table. Enforceability is not an issue. Our arbitration and conciliation talks about it. There is a law which is being drafted to bring in mediation as part of our legal proceedings. And there is a lot happening on that side. So mediation is definitely one of the options. And then with uh, originally, we used to say arbitration, you litigate more than arbitrate. Because most of the things used to go to court while you are in arbitration, which situations have changed post 2012, particularly after 2015 amendments to the Arbitration Act, and then the 2019 amendments. So arbitration is also now back on the block for the options. And the third, which was pure litigation, has also changed its color so many times in last 10, 12, 15 years. We have now NCLT, which takes care of all the corporate issues which used to either go to high courts or company law board and various other tribunals. We have commercial courts, which is almost akin to arbitration, where it's all expedited. And then we have other amendments to other laws, including IP laws and tribunals, and a lot of protection which has come in terms of the litigation arena. So with that background, maybe if I can bring Jyoti first, and then maybe we'll go to Dipti, uh, as to how do you choose uh, in this context, right? Do you think mediation is the only way, particularly post COVID? Do you think litigation and arbitration still hold a chance in certain kind of disputes? And how do you make a choice when you are either entering into a contract or you have already faced a situation where you have received a notice of dispute?
Yeah, Vyapak, so mediation stays, top of of every choice list or every option because a couple of reasons why, right? First and foremost, I think most important, it sort of maintains the commercial relationship, right? That's very, very important. It also ensures business continuity. So if in an IT world, if you sign one MSA, there are something like 50 SOWs under that. So you could have probably one SOW or 5 SOWs which are under dispute, but you can't jeopardize the balance, and that's not good for continuity reasons for us or for a customer. So both ways, I think it's very important to have mediation because by the sound of the word itself, it's a non-litigious sort of a word, which basically says, okay, mediator is not supposed to adjudicate; he's supposed to facilitate a discussion between two parties to be able to come to a solution. And that's best from a business perspective. The other reason why I think mediation would be the first choice for me would be cost efficient. It is a very cost efficient mode. It's time efficient, right? It has a lot of flexibility. You can look at evidence in different formats. It's not confidential. Most important, it's not in the media. It's not something which everyone is talking about. It is very much within the four walls of mediation today. It's on a call. The important part, of course, is that you need to ensure that you have a good settlement agreement. However, all said and done, the other thing that goes to an advantage of mediation is that it's non-binding. You can then go ahead and consider arbitration or litigation after that if everything fails. So I think that's the reason why I would think mediation is important. But if I have to sort of put a clause in an agreement, I would probably put an arbitration clause as my second choice. Because arbitration again is something, and of course, arbitration is nowhere like a mediation. It just definitely has a connotation to being able to appeal, as difficult as admission of an award, appeal to an award is. The fact remains that there is that available. So I would put arbitration in as my choice for the simple reason that in a contract that it is again less costly, it's faster, especially in India where litigations could take longer. You parties have agreed to the arbitrator together. So, you cannot then say it's unfair, etc., etc. There are, however, disadvantages of arbitration also. You can't seek injunctive relief, which you can get in a court. Then there could be, as much as two people have agreed, there could be a lot of time spent in deciding who that arbitrator should be, right? And getting an admission, like I mentioned, of an award is not easy. And the only advantage I see really in a big way is the time and the cost, and confidentiality, of course, is the next thing. On litigation, however, I'm not sort of ruling out litigation at all. I think it continues to be a very powerful tool, and the reasons for that being it's in public records, right? It is something wherein a final judgment provides closure. It sort of it's like sets the record straight. It's like a clear line in the sand where okay, so this is how, and precedents come out of that, right? There could be landmark judgments which you rely on to strengthen your cases in the future. You always depend on some good case laws. So you can't undermine the power of litigation. The court mandates deadlines. Unlike in arbitration, you can keep getting dates. Not that you can't get in the court, but for little more serious matters where you've been asked to appear in court or someone, at least you know the consequences of not coming, right? I mean, I do have a situation where an arbitration has been postponed like 5 times over, COVID being the reason now, but there's, it's just going on. So court mandates definitely have more power. More power. Interim injunctions can be granted. I think that's a very, very big plus. You can go and appeal right up to Supreme Court and beyond if you want to. Evidence is way stricter. There's a structure around the evidence. So I would not rule out litigation. Anyway, today's date, we don't have like Vyapak mentioned, 30 million cases. You don't really have a choice here. But my first option would be mediation followed by arbitration, followed by litigation.
Sure. Thanks a lot. And looks like in spite of all the advantages of mediation and arbitration, litigation still remains one of the important tools, even with delays and the issues which one may face in court. And obviously, one has to make a choice and not blindfoldly decide on arbitration or otherwise. There may be cases where you may actually want to have a precedent so that you can use it for your cases against other customers or otherwise. So that is definitely a very, very good point.
If I have to look at the costs.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I was just saying that when you look at litigation costs, we have to know how strong the case is and how important that case is to go ahead and file it, right? Or fight it.
Sure.
You look at cost, there is the outside counsel cost, there's the law firm cost, there is the forensic expert cost, and IP expert cost. I mean, the cost, travel costs, logistics. There's no end to the cost that really, really build up. So one has to really do a good cost benefit analysis to consider litigation.
Sure, excellent. So with that, Dipti, you obviously would be facing this, question a lot, particularly with the kind of contracts that Mahindra and Mahindra as a group would be entering, and with the varied businesses that you mentioned. Is there a general consensus as a group what you prefer and what you don't prefer, or do you have any thoughts on mediation, and how do you go about it?
So yes, there is a general consensus amongst the group and for all contracts with our clients, dealers, etc. Arbitration is the mode of dispute resolution, and now MCIA is the arbitration or arbitrating institute that is the preferred mode of dispute resolution for us. Prior to that, there used to be ad hoc arbitration, and that was the time when we did face difficulties prior to the amendment happening. Post the amendment on selection of the right type of arbitrator as well as the right type of counsel to arbitrate, we've had success stories of concluding arbitrations, including ad hoc arbitrations, within 18 months time and within a very very tight time frame. So arbitrations is definitely the most sought after mode of dispute resolution. However, all of our agreements have a clause for settlement uh, between the parties, a 30-day period, as well as mediation. So mediation is something that we do not negate at all. And in fact, we have been recently, approached by Bombay Chamber of Commerce and several other mediation agencies requesting us if there are matters that we can refer to mediation. And we have, picked up a few of our matters which have been in litigation for a period of time and tried to see whether we can bring them to mediation. This is subject to the other party also agreeing to the mediation. So far as the Commercial Courts Act is concerned, the Commercial Act is concerned, mediation is a under Section 12(1). And now, recently, under the Consumer Protection Act, which is newly amended, mediation has come in, has a mode for dispute resolution under Chapter 5. And, the entire process of mediation, which has been described in Section 37(1). We have to yet test that out on how that's going to happen, because that's not an area of experience which we have, but we will see how that pans out in time to come. But yes, and so far as litigation is concerned, we utilize litigation where we are not contractually bound to utilize arbitration as a mode for dispute resolution. We also, so when we have that option, we do feel that litigation sometimes works out better if we can file a summary suit, or we have an IBC proceedings which we can file, or we can file, we can file Section 138 for check bounces, etc. And we do feel that we can bring about certain parties on the negotiating table through these measures as well. So we don't rule out litigation, but as a preferred mode of dispute resolution for the entire M&M group as a whole, it's arbitration.
Sure. No, I think it is good to hear as a co-chair of the Mumbai Center of International Arbitration that in less than 3-4 years of time, we have gained that credibility as an institution where a group like Mahindra is, looking for MCIA as a preferred institution. But you and Jyoti, specifically talked about mediation as one of the preferred choice. Everyone puts mediation as first tier in the 2 or 3 tier dispute resolution clause. There are a lot of development on mediation, obviously looking at the popularity. Maybe Alipak, you want to give a 2-minute snapshot on that, and then we can go to Ashish and Damandir.
Sure. I think as Jyoti and Deepti rightly mentioned, mediation has always been there. I mean, I think if we root it back, Section 89 of the Civil Procedure Code, it prescribes mediation as one of the alternate dispute resolution mechanism, but it has not been used so much. I think the utility of mediation it has been sort of discussed and debated, I think, in last 5 or 10 years. And as Jyoti and Deepti mentioned, it helps you to preserve business relationships. It gives you more certainty. Sometimes if you mediate the commercial, you could get a very commercially minded decision, because that's how you will choose someone. And then you are there on the table. I mean, if it does not work for you, you move out of it. So it is sort of a non-binding till such time you sort of agree and sign the settlement agreement. But we have been grappling with a couple of issues, especially in the cross-border context. We lacked an international framework by which we could enforce mediated settlement agreements, and this resulted in what is known as arb met arb clause. And typically, you start an arbitration. During the arbitration, you refer it back to mediation, and if there is a successful mediation, you come back to the arbitrator and you get the settlement recorded in the form of a consent award. And thereafter, you can enforce it under the New York Convention in the reciprocating territories. And India has a reciprocating arrangement with about 48 countries. So this was a long drawn process, which took more than maybe 7-8 months or up to a year from the date you actually signed the mediation document, which is why parties were reluctant to use it. Now that problem has sort of been addressed by the Singapore Convention, which was open for signature on 7th of August. It's called United Nations Convention on International Settlement Agreements resulting from mediation. It was originally passed by the United Nations on 20th December. India is one of the first few signatories, and which is why, as Vyapak, you were mentioning, we are expecting a new law on this subject. Now that we have signed it under Article 253 of the Constitution, we have to enact a new law on that. So we will expect something on this, especially on how do you sort of enforce mediated settlement agreements arising in Singapore or other places. One last point which I wanted to make is there are also mediation provisions under, say, for example, the Commercial Court Act. There are notifications, there are rules where in a commercial case, there is a mandatory requirement for you to mediate and try mediation for 3 months, unless, of course, you are seeking a very urgent relief before the commercial courts. And the last point is, while we do not have a proper legislative framework, but if we look at the entire country, nearly all the high courts, they have a mediation cell where in a regular case, it is very common for judges to sort of refer the parties to mediation cell, and then if there's a successful outcome, that sort of becomes part of the court order. So we have been using it, but now I think with India signing the Singapore Convention, I think we are in a stage where we will move into a very sophisticated regime and take it forward from here.
Sure. Thanks, Alipak. So coming back to the discussion on mediation versus arbitration versus litigation, any thoughts, Ashish, Damandeep, as to how you look at it?
Yeah, so I have a slightly different view. I don't have a preference. I think essentially it's been working like that for the engagements I've been part of. It depends on the kind of the engagement you're entering into. First of all, the relationship. Is it domestic? What are the two parties entering into? Is it employment related? So you're the supplier or you're the customer? What is the nature of the relationship? And is it going to be international? Those are the various factors that have really played a big role in deciding what is the dispute resolution mechanism that we want to follow. And hence, there's no one pattern, one preference that I would say we have. Yes, there are a lot of developments that Alipak just mentioned that are going to make things slightly easier because they're in the international environment, especially in international contracts, it is very difficult to really assess how do you enforce certain settlements or certain rulings. And even in the arbitration space, it's not really very easy to choose a particular arbitration institution or decide very, very easily whether to follow one sort of an institution or one sort of a jurisdiction. So for me, it's essentially the type of the engagement involved, the complexity or the commercial value attached to it, that really plays a very important role in deciding the dispute resolution mechanism, essentially.
So I would just add, just to conclude, I think great advice from my standpoint. I think I would say that dispute resolution or litigation is not a legal strategy or a legal process. It is actually a business strategy and a business process. People make people make business models out of it. People make fortunes out of it, right? That's number one. Number two, I would say that before we start putting pen on the paper and consider resolution clauses as the midnight clauses or the boilerplate clauses, we need to think that ourselves as a party, are we be the defaulting party, or is the counterparty would be a defaulting party? I think the business people or the head of business, whoever, would know from day one that who is gonna screw up in this deal, right? So I think, again, if you are a good project manager, you have good interpersonal skills, and you can get the thought process of your management, other people, you would know that who's gonna be a bad guy in the deal, right? And then accordingly, you need to then convert your boilerplate midnight clauses into something which can help you to drive your business strategy.
Thanks, Ashish. I think you have brought in a great point in terms of the strategy behind disputes, where uh, one generally can predict at the time of the agreement itself that who is going to default, right? Or at least who is likely to default, because one side is giving service, the other is giving payment.
Yeah,
Generally,
yeah,
obviously
and
there are other complex deals as well. But yeah, sorry, Ashish, you were saying something.
no, I think those who hold the checks, those who hold the money is the king, right? So you have to
Yeah.
just see that at what stage the dispute will arise. Would you be in the money, or would the other party be in the money? Accordingly, you have to position it.
Yeah, no, very, very interesting point. And maybe if Mozam, you have any thoughts when this question comes to you from an corporate advisory perspective as to what one should prefer, or it doesn't matter so long as there is a dispute in hand.
Vyapak, I always have thoughts, unfortunately. But all right. So I think Damandeep and Ashish made very, very valid points, and actually ate up into a lot of what I was going to say. So thank you for that. But let me just try and pen down, or rather just state a couple of thoughts that I had. One, of course, is something that Damandeep alluded to, which is saying that she will decide what dispute resolution mechanism to adopt based commercial relationship between the parties. Ashish went a step further and said that, okay, let me try and first analyze as to who is likely to be in default and who's likely to be in the money when dispute arise. So let me give a slightly different perspective to things as well. Uh, from an international scenario point of view, it sometimes often is also the industry preference. So, for example, if you have these big media entertainment houses in the US, in California, and so on and so forth, they still prefer having a pure play litigation clause in their contracts. And not to say that arbitration is not doing great wonders in the United States, but they still have much more comfort in litigating before Californian courts, for instance. And this is even when they are having dealings with Indian parties, which kind of leads to another conundrum, whether your US judgment is enforceable in India and how that really happens. So that's one aspect of things, which is industry preference. And just quickly summing up the other two aspects that I had in mind, one is a question of convenience, and this is also something that Ashish was saying, but let me try and frame it a little differently. How convenient would it be for a party to litigate or arbitrate in a particular forum versus how inconvenient would it be for the other party? So this is, I think this is why Ashish was saying that this is also a business decision, and people often make a lot of money out of these clauses. So that's one aspect, which is of convenience, question of convenience. The third and the last aspect is the question of enforceability. So, and now, and this question becomes extremely important when you're talking about cross-border contracts. Also, something that Damandeep was alluding to. Now, when you have contracts between two parties of two different nations, questions will come into play whether that particular, where you're, let's say, if you're saying that you're litigating in an outside court, whether judgment from that outside court is directly enforceable in India under 44A of RCPC, or it has to be enforced in a roundabout fashion, which is filing a suit in India and then placing that judgment in evidence. So this is when it comes to judgments. Then you're talking about awards. Now, sorry, just in judgments, just one point to be noted is there are only 13 reciprocating countries with India, maybe 14 now with coming in of UAE. And now you compare that with the New York Convention for Enforcement of Arbitral Awards. Original signatories, Vyapak, correct me if I'm wrong, were in excess of 160. And then signatories which India has recognized as parties to convention are about 50 or 51. So awards coming out of those 51 countries will be executable and enforceable in India. Awards coming out of the other maybe 140 or 50 countries which are part of United Nations will not be enforceable under the Arbitration and Conciliation Act in India. So a question of enforceability comes in. Often, I think, just to conclude, you ask yourself 4 questions, right? Especially when you're talking about, and I'm only going to be talking about litigation versus arbitration. You ask yourself 4 questions. What happens if a country is reciprocating under the CPC as well as under the Arbitration and Conciliation Act? What do you choose? My gut choice will always be Arbitration and Conciliation Act, because obviously the case law which has developed is much more enforcement friendly in India of foreign awards. Question number 2 is, what happens if a country is reciprocating country under the CPC but is not a convention country? I think there's a straight short answer that in that case, let's not go for arbitration, because ultimately that award will not be enforceable in India. Question number 3, what happens if the country is a convention country but not a reciprocating country? Then again, you go directly to arbitration. Question number 4, what happens if the country is neither? A country is not a reciprocating country and a country is not a convention country under the Arbitration and Conciliation Act. What do you do then? In such cases, I often say that it's best to have a decree, even if it is a decree from a non-reciprocating court, because at least that you can go about enforcing in the roundabout fashion that I had mentioned earlier. So these are the 4 questions that that you begin with when you're deciding whether to litigate or arbitrate. Sorry, I took more time than I was allotted to.
Sure, no problem. Thanks, Mozam, for that decision matrix. Alipak, you want to take this forward with the other 2 topics?
Sure. So now that we have discussed the various modes of dispute resolution, I think it's also important to discuss settlement of disputes. I think if a dispute is unavoidable, so now we know, what are the various mechanisms. But then the idea is, of course, to reach an amicable settlement and move on. Now, on that premise, of course, settlement of disputes, sometimes it also involves a legal strategy. The applications you file, it could be an application for preliminary hearing, preliminary issues, for arbitral tribunal, which sort of puts a lot of pressure at the inception. It could be issues of arbitrability, so on and so forth, to attack from the right, attack at the inception, and then that sort of leads to a unequal balance between the parties, which ultimately leads to a settlement. We have also seen that, at least in India, a large part of litigation is a litigation fought on interim relief. Only handful of cases, they actually go to real trial. Once a party gets an interim relief, more often than not, matters resolved. So now with this background, if I can ask maybe Damandeep first, how do corporates look at settlement? Is there a roadmap, or when you receive that, when you are strategizing a dispute, do you have a roadmap as to the considerations which should be enough for reaching a settlement, or you go as and how the matter moves from one stage to the other?
Yeah, so it's a very important question, of course, when we talk about disputes. It's essentially, in my view, it really depends upon the bargaining position and the why of the dispute. So, uh, essentially from a commercial angle, you really see how is going to really impact your business continuity, as we had earlier alluded. uh, is it going to really impact my overall business? Maybe sometimes what happens is that you may have a strong position yourself and your case may be very strong, but you're just holding this, one part of the bigger relationship globally and one region, while if you continue with this dispute, it may have an impact on the larger global relationship. So those sort of factors really play a very important role in considering whether to settle or not. And of course, depends upon how far you want to take it. If your case is very strong and you really want to still just try and see if you can bring the other party on the table on your terms and then settle, it does vary from a case to case perspective, the settlement strategy. But the biggest role that the two factors that play in deciding how the settlement progresses is the commercial impact, the commercials involved, and of course the business impact it may have on the overall business and the other businesses that you may have interlinked or intertwined with that particular customer or in that industry or in general.
Thank you. If I may now bring in Mozam and like in international cases, I mean, we know that costs are awarded to a party who loses, right? In India, we are gearing up to that game, but we are not yet there. So, which is why the decision whether to settle or not settle becomes very important. And I mean, along with the commercial considerations, it also depends on how we advise the clients as well. I mean, at what point should you settle? Now, if I can request you to address two aspects. One, given the regime of imposing costs for the international tribunals, how do you sort of, what is the interplay between when to settle and when to sort of take that risk and move on? That's one. And number two, if at all you decide to settle, what is the mechanism? I mean, it could be a consent award in case of an arbitration. In case of litigation proceedings, it could be an application under Order 23, Rule 3 of the CPC and sort of get the consent terms recorded in the court order. So if you can quickly address these 2 points, that will be very helpful.
Sorry, so let me try and address your first point first, which is when to settle. I think my very short response to that would be whenever you get the opportunity. And I go back to what my first boss told me right at the inception of my legal career, which was a bad settlement is often better than a successful litigation. So I just go back to that point, and it often is, especially keeping in with the cost and the time taken, and companies wanting to move on with their lives and with their businesses. So one short answer: whenever you can, please settle. Second is let me just try and divide your second answer in two different buckets. One is a pre-dispute settlement, and one is a post-dispute settlement. So pre-dispute settlement is when settlement before you've actually shot the arrow of arbitration or shot the arrow of litigation, and that is also one of the more critical stages of actually settling. And this is again going back to my same point when I was discussing about the pre-dispute stage and the settlement talks between principals, goes to the same point. Second aspect of things is post-dispute settlement, which is what you were referring to, Alipak. Your dispute can be litigation, can be arbitration, can be a pure play mediation as well. One thing which one should ordinarily look at is the enforceability of that settlement. Right, that becomes a critical question for everybody settling. So in a pure play mediation scenario, how effective your mediated settlement is to enforce, there's still a bit of question around that particular aspect, right? So unless, like you said, unless India comes out with a law after the Singapore Convention which kind of gives an enforceability to mediated settlements, we are in a kind of a limbo, because the only opportune or the only remedy that an aggrieved party has against a party who is not wishing to follow through on the mediated settlement is to sue for breach of agreement, right? So again, you're going back to reinitiating some sort of a dispute resolution mechanism. The second is enforceability of a settlement in litigation. Now that can happen through mediation, Alipak, which is what you were referring to. Sometimes, you go to court, both parties agree to go before a mediator. In Delhi High Court's case, the court would ordinarily say that, okay, I'm putting you before Delhi High Court Mediation Center, and you guys go before the mediator, you guys arrive at the settlement agreement. That settlement agreement comes back to the court and is then enforced in form of a consent decree. So consent decree becomes automatically enforceable, right? So enforceability is good, is very, very good when you're talking about consent decrees and settlement agreements leading to consent decrees, and often unappealable, an additional advantage. The second thing is settlements in arbitration. Again, can be through mediation, can be through through regular settlement discussions. In mediations, you've touched upon the ARB Med ARB clause, where you first go for arbitration, then you go for mediation. Whatever the settlement agreement you arrive at in the mediation, you file it before the arbitrator, who files a consent award basis that settlement. So this is your regular ARB Med ARB procedure. And then, of course, you can have a direct settlement agreement between the parties, give that settlement agreement to the arbitrator, and the arbitrator passes a consent award basis that thing. Again, enforceability factor is high. So in both these, under both these regimes, be it litigation, be it arbitration, aim is always to either get a consent decree or get a consent award. Don't just leave matters at the settlement agreement stage. You should follow through with that next step. I hope I've answered your question.
Sure. Thank you very much for that, Maudham. And if I may add, I think we have not discussed conciliation because of paucity of time. I would just like to add the mechanism for conciliation is also prescribed under the Arbitration and Conciliation Act. And once there is a successful conciliation, that can take the nature of an arbitral award, consent award, and that can be accordingly enforced. Now, moving on, the last topic for today is we have discussed about various mechanisms, how to sort of run a dispute, how to settle a dispute, how to avoid a dispute. Now, the last question becomes managing the cost of the dispute. If you have to run a dispute, it all obviously entails a lot of cost. Now, with that, may I first ask Damayanti, how important is managing cost? And in your experience, does quality trump over cost, or how do you sort of balance both? And then after you answer, then I'll come to Deepti as well.
Yeah, so yes, it's a very important aspect to consider. You've reached a stage where you have no other choice but to go ahead. So I think it really depends upon what you're trying to achieve as the outcome, and how much then you really want to spend to get that outcome. How critical your outcome is to you. The cost essentially depends on that. So it's not like a set rule that you can have for yourself to say, I'm only going to spend this much for A kind of dispute or this much of B kind of dispute. So that's not the scale or the measuring that you have. So it depends on the outcome, and an outcome differs on a case-to-case basis, right? The second aspect that really plays an important role is who is your outside counsel, in especially for in-house counsels. What kind of ongoing relationship you have with them? Do they understand what you need, how you need it? Are they working with you, or are you engaging them on a case-to-case basis? What are the kind of engagements you have with the outside counsel? How are you engaging the outside counsel? Your commercial arrangements with them really plays a very important role in deciding and managing the costs in relation to the dispute. So two very important factors, keeping in mind the outcome and also keeping in mind who you engage, how you engage, what is the engagement structure there, the commercial engagement structure that you have, to be able to manage the overall cost of the dispute, because that does, as an in-house counsel, that does get challenged or does get a lot of visibility from auditors, from the management, and that's something that you have to continuously keep monitoring. It's not like a one-time thing. It's something that you have to continuously keep monitoring to say, I'm spending so much on a particular sort of kind of disputes. Is there something that I'm doing wrong? Perhaps the strategy needs to change. I need to go back to the drawing board to say, can I change my litigation strategy to say my costs can come down, even though I can't help get into disputes? So all those factors play a very important role in managing the costs.
Thank you for that, Damanji. Now let me come back to Deepti. As we mentioned, India strictly does not have a cost regime. Like, although we have had amendments to the Arbitration Act in 2015 that has introduced a cost regime. Even the Commercial Courts Act, it speaks about cost, but then strictly the arbitral tribunal or the courts, they are reluctant to impose costs, and even if they impose, it's a very nominal amount. Now, with that sort of a background, I mean, how important is evaluation of cost of the dispute, and how do you go about strategizing this?
Yes, so basically, there are 3 things that we do. One is I did talk about a large part of our disputes being against disputes which are in the consumer courts. So the first thing that we chalked out in doing was to try and remove large size law firms who used to manage our entire portfolio in specific regions and try and get into local lawyers. The way we were able to do that is because I have a team of 10 very good lawyers who've been there, done that, and have had great experience and exposure in litigation. So essentially, we sourced out local lawyers and basically reduced costs. And therefore, we have empaneled more than 50, 60 lawyers who manage our consumer litigation on fixed fee courts at district forum levels, at state commission levels, at national commission levels, up to the Supreme Court. That has, because we have volumes of consumer litigation, the best way to reduce costs is to reduce, to have fixed kind of a fixed range of fee quotes amongst lawyers. It varies between a Mumbai lawyer versus a lawyer in a remote location in Assam or Bhopal. But we still have a range. And in that sense, we meet or manage costs in so far as the numbers are concerned. So far as arbitrations, as I said, that we do prefer arbitration as a mode of dispute resolutions. Managing costs for ad hoc litigation, we were able to achieve by trying to have kind of ballpark figures or caps on our fee quotes at various stages. So we have done many arbitrations and we have a sense of the timeline, the amount involved, the type of matter, etc. And we have, over a period of years, got some very good independent lawyers as well as law firms who are now aware of the kind of litigation that we have and are willing to work with us on ballpark figures or fixed fee quotes, which are flexible. As in, if the litigation takes a turn for for something which wasn't anticipated, they are not stuck to that cost. But at the end of the day, that also helps us manage costs. And now with MCIA coming in, we do we do have some sense of what would be the costs that are involved and the timelines that are involved. So far as payment to arbitrators go, so far as timeline within which arbitration can cancelled or continued, etc. Uh, so far as quality is concerned, quality is of paramount importance to us as well. So none of this is being achieved at the cost of quality. It has taken us a lot, my team, a lot of effort, and because it's a very strong team, they themselves are very well equipped to deal with written statements, evidences, documentation, etc. So they are like literal, stepping stones for the external lawyers that we brief. So in that sense, also we have been able to maintain costs. And only in so far as criminal litigation, arrest warrants, litigation against senior management, where we have no choice but to go before the court and seek a quashing, or wherever, it's like it's something where we just have to do something overnight. In those kinds of things, there are a restriction to costs, but that's exceptional, and that is acceptable to us, because uh, for us, any employee of the company, or anything that would affect the reputation of the company, we would not compromise at all so far as the cost is concerned. But uh, with all these factors that I just spoke about, we have been really able to have a sense of costs. And then when you spoke about arbitration, even in ad hoc arbitrations in the last year, we've had 3 or 4 awards wherein we have won the arbitration, and the opposite side has had been asked to pay our costs of legal fees. So that is a big change that we notice even under ad hoc arbitration. And I'm pretty sure that the same thing will MCIA. We've just begun a few arbitrations. We don't know how it's going to pan out, but I'm pretty sure the way it is going, it's going to be great. Especially basis the rules under which it operates. But yes, for us, maintaining costs, considering the volumes, is very, very important. And I think, we monitor our costs through annual reports and mid-year reports, which we share with our business. And year on year, we have been able to show reduction, relatively a large amount of reduction in our costs.
Sure. Thanks a lot, Dipti, on that. And maybe any closing thoughts, Jyoti or Ashish, on that, if you have any views on the last 2 points that we discussed with Damandeep and Dipti. Otherwise, we can take one question, and we are already at 4:30, so we might want to, close the session with that.
I think just on costs and fees and quality, and obviously quality is very, very important. And I think nobody, neither of the as lawyers would like to compromise on that. We also have something, something different that we've done in the UK and the UAE, where we have conditional fee agreements with law firms. So I think that's also something we propose, and that seems to be also working really well, because then you're able to really balance out your costs. But I think most of the other points have been covered.
You can take the Q&A, please. Yeah. Nothing
Yeah.
to add from my side here.
Sure, thanks. I think there is one question which directly goes to Mozam. But before that, let me see if there is any thing that I can. There are quite a few questions already, but there is one question which says importance of documentation and evidence before the authorities, and particularly challenging constitutional validity of a provision under fiscal laws. Anybody, one of you want to take this up in terms of the importance of evidence when you are doing a regulatory litigation, and also challenging of any constitutional validity? Maybe Ashish, if you have any thoughts, or Jyoti or Damandeep.
So, I mean, Ashish, go ahead. Otherwise, I
No,
feel
I
my
mean,
telecom experience is.
I think
No, so I mean,
as a growing and a highly regulated, business, I think challenging some of the provisions is like, I would say, business as usual. And it's not like, let's say, it's the cause is not attributed to the government, because uh, it's a long process for government to pass any law, right? And I think the businesses move very fast, right? So at times the laws are not really updated, and they're not like fit for the purpose of the business. And then when you get stuck with some of the bureaucrats who want to interpret the law in the old-fashioned side, you have nothing but to take help from the court. So I'm sure Jyoti has spent a lot of time in telecom, and I've spent time in telecom, internet broadcasting. So I think I think litigating with the government on the policy is like business as usual, and government people do understand that. I mean, they don't take offense of that. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I think there is one question, but maybe Mozam can respond to that directly on an email in reference to the reciprocity and the enforcement part. We can also share our paper which deals with this aspect in detail. So with that, I think we are already crossed 4:30, and we would want to draw close to this session. Thanks everyone to join this session. Very, very interesting. Thank you, Ashish, Damandeep, Priti, and Jyoti for sharing very candid views on this. And hope participants got some, advice from your experience, and we would definitely conduct some of this in future. So thanks a lot for, joining us. And thanks again, Association of Corporate Counsel, to hold it along with us. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.